there is no secret to happiness, but there is a science to it. That's your ethos. That's your slogan. That is really what you live and breathe. What does that mean to you?
Because we understand that if we want to study type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, we can apply scientific principles to learn about them. Yeah. But we can also do that to learn about happiness. And I think that especially now in the world we live in, we appreciate how important mental health is in that equation. Whereas before, it maybe wasn't as big a part of the conversation as we used to see. We can study the science of happiness, and we can apply what we learn to help people, and children specifically, to live happier, healthier lives. What's happened is our modern world, our brain has not caught up with our modern world yet. And so we have this natural tendency to focus on bad, negative, challenging things. And so step number one, the key to any behavior change, step number one is awareness, right? We have to know what it is that we want to change or to do more of. And so when we think about this negativity bias, it's like, okay, if this came pre-installed, and I tend to focus on that, you know, if you receive 10 compliments today and one person says one bad thing, when you go home
that's
tonight,
your focus.
And you put it, that's what you think about. So we have to be aware that we were born with this. And then the question becomes, okay, now that I have that awareness, what do I do about it? And we actually have to essentially rewire our brain to focus on good things. There's some people that find purpose and meaning through raising a child. Some people, in terms of psychological richness, want different experiences. They want to travel and see the world and try new food and learn new things and see new cultures. And so we're all different, and it really comes down to this concept of, okay, well, what is it for me? And it really is a personal thing. And I think that as a parent, when you start to ask those questions to yourself and start talking about with your children and getting to know your children, each child is different, right? A lot of parents are like, their kids can be very different. But it really is having that conversation to think, what are the things that you like, that bring you joy, that fill you up?
Yeah. So every child has their own purpose.
That's right.
And today we're excited to welcome Dr. Gillian Mandich, a leading happiness researcher and nutrition expert with a specialization in child and youth health. Dr. Mandich has spoken at global events, including the United Nations University for Peace, and has worked at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto on important health initiatives for children.
And Dr. Mandich is here to share insights on how we can use nutrition, even genetics, and emotional well-being to help our children build a strong foundation for happiness and resilience from day one.
Dr. Gillian Mandich holds a PhD in health science, specializing in the science of happiness and its impact on health. She also has a master's degree in health sciences from Western University with a specialization in child and youth health. Dr. Mandich is a sought-after speaker, including at the United Nations University for Peace Gross Global Happiness Summit, where she presented on the mental health implications for Generation Z in a digital world. Her work includes knowledge translation and science communication at Sick Kid Hospital in Toronto, where she contributed to Meant to Prevent, a type 2 diabetes prevention initiative for children and youth. Dr. Mandich's research focuses on how nutrition, genetics, and emotional well-being shape long-term happiness and lives.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So good to have you out here.
I'm so happy to be here.
Beautiful, sunny Los Angeles, California.
I know.
All happy and healthy.
I went to the beach this morning.
I heard.
That's happiness right there.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Very, very pleased to have you here, Gillian. And it's a pleasure.
Having me.
And with your wealth of knowledge, we hope to tap into that today and provide parents some really useful information.
Exciting even to get into the topic of discussion around genomics. That's a big part of my world, maybe even those that drive happiness. We know that biology is only part of the story. We're going to be talking a lot about that as well. Certain genes, COMT, BDNF, DRD2, the whole dopamine connection. So it's going to be a really fun time.
I'm very excited.
So to sort of set the stage for the necessary need for this information, I just wanted to look at the state of children's health generally in America these days, where in the space of 40 years we've gone from 1 in 5 children having some sort of chronic ailment, including mental, to 1 in 5. So 40 years from 1 in 50 to 1 in 5 children with some sort of chronic condition. Never happened in history before. So this is why we call this the first 7 years so important, because this is when the formation, the platform, the root of everything is established. And if we look at those first 7 years, we see that in the first 7, by the age of 7, 95% of the brain growth has occurred. So the child's brain at 7 is 95% of the adult brain. So all of these key pathways, key learnings, key experiences are being placed at that time. Mm-hmm. And if we look and just focus in on children's emotional and mental health, we see on the next slide that we've got 1 in 5, nearly 20% of children who suffer from some sort of anxiety, psychological, emotional disorder. Mm-hmm. So your work, your experience, your knowledge is very, very important. And we hope to learn and give that today.
Absolutely. And I'm so happy to be here. When I first got into research, when I started my master's, I remember reading this statistic that said that this generation of children is going to be the first generation where they may be outlived by their parents.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And that was the catalyst for me to begin to focus on children. Sure. Children are our future, right? We want to raise healthy, happy children. And we've seen, to your point, so many changes. And so it's scary, but it's also, like you said, I see childhood and all the research sort of suggests that especially the early years, we have this window of opportunity where when you can establish healthy habits with children, they are more likely to continue them into their adulthood. Sure. And so focusing on that is something I'm very passionate about.
And those first 7 years is when parents have the most control.
Exactly.
For lack of a better word, over their children.
Right.
In terms of compliance, introducing to them the right foods, nutrition, supplementation, environment. Yeah.
And so we're going to get into the science of happiness in early childhood, and even maybe a little bit around the role of genetics. But I wanted to start off with this sentence: there is no secret to happiness, but there is a science to it. That's your ethos. That's your slogan. That is really what you live and breathe. What does that mean to you?
You know, it's as someone who has a background in child and youth health, focusing now primarily on happiness, mental health, but also that extension of that is everything: nutrition, sleep, physical activity, genetics. It's something where I think when people say, how do you study happiness? It's confusing for people, right? Because we understand that if we want to study type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, we can apply scientific principles to learn about them. Yeah. But we can also do that to learn about happiness. And I think that especially now in the world we live in, we appreciate how important mental health is in that equation. Whereas before, it maybe wasn't as big a part of the conversation as we used to see. And so we can study the science of happiness, and we can apply what we learn to help people, and children specifically, to live happier, healthier lives.
I love it. Medicine. Whether it's naturopathic, conventional, pediatrician, medicine for little bodies. It's an art and science.
It really is.
Is that happiness also?
You know, I think the interesting thing is if you ask any parent, what do you want for your child? They say, I want my child to be happy, right? That's the number one response you'll get every single time. And so then the question is, well, how do we do that? And that's where we have this gap. And this is why it's important to have the conversations like we're having right now, because we need to learn how to do that. How do we help to raise happy, healthy children? What can we teach them? What can we provide in terms of information, resources, nutrition, supplementation, programs? What is it that we can do for children to help them to figure out how to be happy? And especially when we look at the data right now in terms of things like anxiety, stress, all of these things, those numbers are skyrocketing at rates we have never, ever seen. It's unprecedented. And so this is a crucial conversation because we have this generation, in particular, the current generation that's being raised, where we're seeing them really struggling. And so how do we help them? And how do we apply scientific principles so that we're helping them in an evidence-based perspective?
Great. And so looking at that whole picture in terms of, the whole and all the different components, part of it, what percentage or what are the emphasis on genetics, nutrition, environment, learning, behavior? What part do all those play?
So when we look in terms of happiness specifically, there's sort of three big players at the table. So genetics is a huge player, absolutely. And a lot of happiness research actually comes from looking at twin studies. So what researchers did was they found monozygotic twins, so identical twins that were separated at birth. And so from that research, you can start to tease out a little bit of genetics versus environment. But again, we're studying humans. So it's not like we can put people in a lab and watch them. So
variable.
But it can give us a good indication. And we do see absolutely that genetics do play a huge role. But it sort of provides a range. So you could be from, the one end to the other end. And then the other piece that comes in is our environment. And our environment plays a big role. And I think all of us living through the pandemic understand how environment or lack thereof can affect our mood and our mental health. And then the third piece, which is where a lot of my work focuses on right now, is our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors. Because we can't change our genes. Maybe gene expression, we can influence a little bit, environment. But if we think about our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors, we live in our head every single day, right? And we control what we do for the most part. And so especially with children, this is a huge area of opportunity where, especially when they're young, establishing healthy habits can help set them up for success in adulthood.
You mentioned you can't change your genes. I'm in absolute belief and on the same page as that. You can perhaps manage genetic expression.
Correct.
Is there an argument to be made, though, that happiness is a muscle and the more you work it out, the better you are at it?
I often, especially when I'm talking to children, I sort of explain it like it's a habit. It is like a muscle. If you think about it, sort of like if you want to be strong, you can go to the gym and you can lift weights. And over time, if you do that consistently, you get stronger. And happiness is the same way, our mental health, right? Like sometimes I go to like one of those home design stores and I see that sign that says choose happy. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way, right? We don't wake up in the morning and we choose our outfit and we choose happy. We actually have to work at it. But it's the same thing as physical activity or nutrition, right? If we want to be healthy and happy, we have to work at it. It doesn't just fall into our lap. And I think a lot of times, especially with the modern conveniences of the world that we live in, we think it should just happen. Sure. But it doesn't. It is a habit. It is a skill. And if we think about it like a muscle, the other thing is like people always say, I will be happy when, fill in the blank, right? I will be happy when I have X amount of dollars, when my kid does whatever it is. But the reality is happiness is not a destination, right? We don't arrive at it. And so I don't see happiness that way. I see happiness the same way that I see physical activity or nutrition. So what I mean by that is, say, for example, you had a green smoothie in the morning and you put all the supplements and all the superfoods, everything in it. No one would ever drink that smoothie and then be like, thank you, Gillian.
Terrible.
I've reached nutritional wellness, right? We would never say that because we understand that if we want to be healthy, we have to choose healthy food most of the time. Or no one would go into the gym and have like the best workout of their life and then leave the gym and text their friend or their partner and say, I just had the best workout of my life. I've reached fitness, right? We see those as a practice and as a habit. And that's how I also see happiness. It's something that we have to work at on a continual basis for our entire life.
Okay, but aren't some people more predisposed to being able to experience happiness? And actually, really, I'm coming back full circle to the genetic susceptibilities. So some of us maybe are a little more predisposed to having the happiness hormones readily available, where others are maybe a little more predisposed to being on the side of, introvert and maybe a little bit more reserved and depressed. I mean, this is the whole genetic side.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So, often I'll have someone ask me a question, like they know an Eeyore, from Winnie the Pooh, the Eeyore type character, right? They're like, the glass is half empty. And there absolutely is a huge genetic role. But I think the key piece is that the conversation does not end there. Right. And that we all do have some autonomy and some opportunity to influence it beyond there. We all have this range. And yes, some people genetically, myself, for example, my mom was going through boxes in the basement a little while ago. And she found my report cards from when I was a child. And I was reading like my kindergarten report card and it said, Gillian's a fairly happy child. And I would have to say, like, I'm probably on the happier side genetically. But even that being said, I really, my one regret, and it's not really a regret, but I wish I would have measured my happiness before I started studying happiness. Because I try all of the things that I read about in my research and I'm happier now, I would have to say, but I don't have the baseline to check that. But the other thing is, and I think this is an important piece of the conversation too, I didn't realize that when you talk about happiness all the time and you research happiness, people sometimes think you're happy all the time. And I'm not. I'm a happiness researcher. I'm not happy all the time. And it's because there's a lot of research. Sometimes in literature, it's referred to as like the dark side of happiness, where people that try to be happy all the time end up being less happy than other people. And I think this is an important piece of the conversation to include as well, is that can we be happier than we are right now? Absolutely. Can we be happy all of the time? Absolutely not. And I think that part of the conversation, it kind of goes back to childhood. Like I remember, like if a child's outside riding a bike and they fall and they scrape their knee and they cry, what do parents often do? Comfort, don't cry, it's okay. But it's like, if you fall and you scrape your knee and you're in pain, crying kind of makes sense. And so part of the conversation is opening up this dialogue about emotions, right? And about feeling emotions that match the experiences that we're going through. And so I think a lot of times we've been told to like not feel some of those more challenging emotions and just try to be happy all the time, but that's not the point. And paradoxically, it's when we start to, especially with children, tapping into teaching them how to identify what emotions they're feeling and why they're feeling them, that promotes healthy psychological functioning.
Okay. So what would you say, as a parent's role, what would be the most important actions, thoughts, teaching that they could give their children to start them off on this pathway, to create that and establish
setting the
that?
stage
Yeah.
right from early years.
I get asked by parents all of the time, especially through my work when I was at Sick Kids, which is the largest children's hospital in Canada. The number one question I would get from a parent is, how do I help my child be happy? I want my child to be happy. And the reality is that we can't make anybody else be happy. We can't push happiness on someone. We can't force happiness. And as a parent, my answer is always, step number one is children don't listen to what parents say. They watch what they do.
Role model.
And so if you want your child to be happy, the best thing you can do is to model that behavior for yourself and to include that in part of the conversation. It's very similar to another question I get asked all the time. It's like, my children are on devices all of the time. And my first question is, well, how often are you on your device, right? And so it's really, especially in the family unit, it's creating habits that are conducive to doing that and to establishing those sort of behaviors, right?
No, leading by example.
Exactly. It's so important because you can't force a child to be happy, but you can create conditions which make it more likely for your child to experience more moments of happiness. And that's the key piece.
And when
no, I was just going to, I love all that. And I was just going to mention, you must have seen this, happy moments between children and their parents, a multi-method and multi-informant perspective. A lot of studies, of which I know this is your area of expertise.
This is a brand new one, the
meta-analysis. Well, do you want to speak to it? Because I think research shows that positive family dimensions, such as communication, open emotional bonds, parental support, strongly predict happiness in children. And I think you said something so important a couple of minutes ago, which is, no one, genetically or otherwise, is meant to be happy all the time. I think that's probably a DSM diagnosis of some sort I'm not familiar with, but it's an imbalance, and nor should we be sad all the time. There's got to be a happy medium. But we're not geared that way. It's probably not even survivalistic. But what this is talking about is, just to your point, it starts early. And our viewers, our listeners want to hear just what Dr. Murray was asking. How is this best established? And it sounds like what you're saying is it really starts with openness and communication and role modeling.
Absolutely. And, I talk to people all the time, and especially parents right now. When I ask parents, were you taught how to be happy in school? No one ever says yes, because that was never a part of the conversation for parents today growing up. Things are changing now, which I think is really exciting. But no wonder we're confused, because if we were never taught, as a parent who's trying to raise healthy children, if you were never taught how to be happy, and then you add in media, social media, marketing, TV, movies that sort of project this image of what happiness is, which is
social
incorrect.
media.
Absolutely. Social media is a big one. It's like, no wonder we're confused, because we don't even understand what it is that we're promoting, right? And I think that when we look at the family unit, there's such an opportunity to have conversations with children, talk about their feelings. Why are things going on? Especially at the dinner table, right? It's this great place if you can eat family dinner together, which research shows is something that can be a very powerful thing to increase communication with children, to learn about what they're doing. Because especially, a lot of kids want to just go home and put on the TV or play video games, but having that communication with family is something that is absolutely critical.
And it's missing from this day and age. I know in your clinical practice, Dr. Murray, you face, parents with dilemmas all the time in their children's screen time, and it's just overwhelming. And then I'm sure you're guiding them out of that as often as possible. But what are some of the detriments of early child? We're talking as early as maybe 2 years, like just shut up and watch, and then what they end up watching is detrimental to their happiness psychology, right?
So ultimately, what's happening with these last few generations, it's an experiment ongoing.
Right.
Nobody actually knows the full impact, the full consequences of all of this. All we can do is go back to our original way of being and live that way as much as possible in today's environment.
I know you're often writing prescriptions for get out into nature.
Yeah.
I love it.
Get off screen time, and like that's
Yeah.
it's sometimes that simple. And before we get too much into the weeds of like the how-to and the actionable around this, because there is some prescriptive advice that we can be giving, not in the sense of drug, but prescriptive recommendations, and we love doing that on this first 7 years. Can we take a step back and sort of define the biology of happiness from a genetic perspective that's born not out of the CRISPR future, potentially, how we can maybe manipulate genes, but what we're designed as humans to experience in the realm of dopamine, serotonin, or adrenaline, some of these simple neurotransmitters, which are in essence how we emote and how we feel and how we experience the environment around us. How would you explain that to a new parent, maybe a seasoned parent, and how they may see in their children variations of these neurochemistry pools and how that applies to happiness?
Yeah, we are just a little chemistry experiment going on every single day, right? And so when we think about sort of the ways when we feel good, whether it's dopamine or norepinephrine, like all these exciting high affect emotions that we feel, it's really important. And I think one of the things sort of along those lines that I often talk with parents about is this concept of the negativity bias. So essentially, how when you buy like a new computer and it comes with like pre-installed software and you have to like reinstall better software, I sort of think that as humans, we have what's called the negativity bias, which is our tendency to focus on the negative, even in the midst of much more positive things. And historically, this was a good thing, because if we hit rewind and go back in time, we had to be worried about threats all of the time. But what's happened is our modern world, our brain has not caught up with our modern world yet. And so we have this natural tendency to focus on bad, negative, challenging things. And so step number one, the key to any behavior change, step number one is awareness, right? We have to know what it is that we want to change or to do more of. And so when we think about this negativity bias, it's like, okay, if this came pre-installed, and I tend to focus on that, if you receive 10 compliments today and one person says one bad thing, when you go home
That's
tonight,
your focus.
and you put it, that's what you think about. So we have to be aware that we were born with this. And then the question becomes, okay, now that I have that awareness, what do I do about it? And we actually have to essentially rewire our brain to focus on good things. But what we know from the psychology of behavior change is that we can change our habits. It's the most difficult at the beginning, but over time we start to change that habit. And so I think as parents, starting to change that habit in a child to help them focus on the good things is so important, right? When they come home from school, it's, how was your day? Often they'll say the bad thing that happened, right? But it's like, what were the good things? And this is something that I think when we can start to mentally focus on the good things, it changes us neurochemically as well, because it starts to change the chemistry experiment that's going on in our body.
Can we bring this back to role playing then for a second? So, for example, if you were going to ask your child about their day, I've got two children. Well, they're not so young anymore, a 17 and a 19-year-old. But, I would often, because I'm a huge believer in role playing and modeling, often first explain my day and as much of the positive as I could possibly bring up, and then actually posit the question to them, how was your day? So in effect, hopefully what I was trying to do was role model the response I was reaching for, rather than just sort of simply state, hey, how was your day? And then we are, as children even, pre-designed to, as you said, focus on the negative, right? What else can parents do? What else can they sort of through role play or modeling to entice a positive or happy response from their child, would you say?
Yeah, if I had a magic wand and I could sort of make one wish for parents, it would be to introduce the concept of gratitude to children from a very early age. The research on this is so vast now. It's very clear that gratitude and happiness are highly correlated. And when we're grateful, we tend to be happier. And so especially as children, even if they're young and they don't understand what the word gratitude means. And gratitude just means taking time to think about things in your life that you appreciate or that you're thankful for. Even when they're young, they're too young to understand that concept. It's what made you happy today? What was a good thing that happened today? And establishing that and asking children those questions from a very early age is something that the research really informs sort of in terms of healthy psychological development in children. And so There's ways to incorporate gratitude so that it becomes a habit and a practice for families. So whether that is, when you're eating a meal together, everyone goes around and says one thing that they're grateful for that day, or that made them happy, depending on the age, the conversation changes. One of my favorite exercises, and I have seen this, and especially when I work at Sick Kids, one of the most powerful things when I would talk to parents is this concept of a gratitude jar. So you just take a jar, and with your children, you write things down every day that was a good thing, and you put them in the jar. And then it becomes, especially when children are having a bad moment, you can encourage them to go to the jar and take one of the things out and read it. And it helps to shift their mood, especially when they're caught in one of those sort of spirals that are going downwards. And this is something that it's a visual reminder, which is important. And it's also, they're going back to their own memories. And so that seems to be something that can be very profound for children, is helping them with a tool, the jar. And it's low cost, right? It costs nothing. You can just recycle a jar. And yet the impact can be really profound.
Yeah. And then,
I love that.
Looking at the emotional part and now looking at the sort of physiological part component, would you like to speak to this really recently, rapidly gaining research field of the microbiome? The gut-brain connection, the brain affecting the gut, vice versa, the gut affecting the brain.
Yeah.
When we look, we see 90% of the serotonin in the body is sitting in the small intestine at all times, not the brain. So there's this huge intimate connection between gut, brain, gut. Would you like to speak to that?
Absolutely. And this is why I love science, is because we continue to learn new things, right? And I think if we were sort of rewind back in time, we thought, we operated in isolation, right? Like your mentally is your brain, and focus on, if you've got a gut problem, you go see your endocrinologist, whatever it is. And we're realizing that as humans, everything is all related, and especially with the gut. And I think parents see this a lot, because you can see with your children when you feed them how they act, right?
Oh, almost immediately.
And
I would argue.
You give your children tons of sugar, and what happens, right? And so what we put in our body is such a huge part, but it goes beyond just like the nutrients of it. It's how it affects us. And it's like, the term hangry, right? When your child hasn't eaten, or you're it's a real thing. And when we understand that nutrition not only fuels us from a sort of physical, how we function in the world, but mentally as well. And the research just keeps coming out on this, that it's all so connected. And it's really something that I think we never focused on before, and yet it's a very critical piece of it, right? And how we feed our body, what we do in terms of food, supplementation, nutrition, all of that plays a really key role in our moods, in how we feel, and how we process and regulate emotion, in how we interpret experiences. It's such a huge part of it, right?
Sure.
It's making headlines. Why a healthier gut can lead to a happier mind. I mean, and this starts in early childhood. Your clinical experience around children's microbiomes being wiped out for so many different reasons, not just the fact that supplements are maybe an important part of reestablishing diversity, but unnatural birthing, or let's call it, C-section, the lack of breastfeeding. I mean, this is all really maybe impacting happiness out of the gate from day one.
No, I mean, the real understanding of microbiome now is that, it starts from birth. It's actually starting as soon as, the breastfeeding occurs. And the diversity of food is what sets up a balanced microbiome. So the diversity of food is the first base, so we have to look at diet, food, nutrition. And then if anything impacts those beneficial bacteria, then we have to address that, replace it, keep it going.
Right.
The question is, with the microbiome, we're actually outnumbered by the number of bacteria in the microbiome versus the number of cells in our body. So if they're not the right guys, it's a problem, especially for children. So understanding the importance, that's really the base of our physiological health, well-being, immune system. And obviously all of that translates into how we feel, where the happiness part comes in.
Absolutely.
So if we can keep the microbiome happy, I think that's a big part of keeping the child happy as well.
Yeah, I often, when I'm sort of talking to parents, I sort of give the analogy, if you want to build a house, right, you need all the things to build a house. So you need doors and windows and bricks and cement. But But if you don't have windows or cement, how do you build a house? And our gut is cement or windows. It's an essential part that we have not realized until now, but the data is coming out. But we need all of these things. They're foundational, right? And it's something that I think when we think about a child and like, how do I help them be happy? We're often not thinking automatically about that, but it's such, and I love that we're having this conversation because it's such an important part. What we put in children's bodies and the history that they've had from birth really do play a huge role in what they're feeling now. And if something's going wrong, or if children aren't, performing cognitively or performatively or academically, the question is to look at these sort of things, right? And to really focus on that as a parent.
Well, if we can control one thing, or at least the majority of what nutrition is about for the first 7 years, it's what you're putting in your child's mouth, or perhaps maybe more importantly, what you're not putting in your child's mouth.
Yes.
But before we get into the weeds too deeply into the role of nutrition, mood, behavior, and happiness, because we want to get there, we want to get deep on that. What we were talking about a minute ago, I wanted to bring this up. This is not so recent, but I think it's powerful. The role of positive emotions.
It's an iconic paper.
It is. And I thought you'd know it, and I think I'm right. And what this is really getting into is this broaden and build theory. So what you were talking about a moment ago just made me think this. I think it applies throughout all 7 years. The research shows that better health, energy, and fitness from the physical resources, of course, and that we can understand, part of which is nutrition. But the main idea is that experiencing positive emotions helps to broaden people's thinking and behaviors. For example, when people feel happy, they're more likely to explore new ideas and try new things and connect with others. And I think that, if I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, it starts in the family nucleus, doesn't it?
It absolutely often does, especially when we're looking at children. And, I think when you start to increase positive emotions, and when we look at happiness, frequency of positive emotions is much better predictor of our happiness than intensity.
Right.
So it's really about, and often when people think this, I will be happy when, they think about the big moments, the birthday party, the graduation, but really it's about the day-to-day sort of micro moments of happiness and joy that start to broaden and build. It also, when we experience something good, it creates what we call in research an upward spiral of positive emotions. And I think a lot of us are often more familiar with the downward spiral, right? Where we have like one thought and like the world is ending or we're dying. Right? But to Barbara Fredrickson's work, it's really about these positive spirals, because when something good happens, you have a bit more pep in your step, right? You're a little bit more friendly. You're a little bit happier. You're more likely to connect with someone. And that's a huge piece of it. And what we do know from research is that social connection is a really big part of happiness. It's necessary, but not sufficient in terms of living a happy life.
Right.
And the family unit is the first place that children often experience that connection, right? It's connection with
Perfect.
family.
So let's segue right into the dinner table, because I think that there's this abundance or exposure to social media through screens. So we got to minimize that as much as possible, and an underexposure to family, internal nuclear family culture, and what exactly we're talking about around the kitchen table. Doesn't matter if the kid's 0 to 2 and they're throwing food at you, or they're a little more mature into their 3rd, 4th, 5th year. Why is nutrition so important? Why is the experience of eating as a family so important? Just walk us through some practical ways parents can introduce nutrient-rich, mind-boosting foods that are going to contribute to happiness, but also the family unit experience, if that's not too much to cover.
I
It's
love
a lot.
it. And to touch on sort of what we had talked about earlier, when we think about childhood being this window of opportunity to establish healthy habits, having a meal together as a family is one of those habits that can be really, really powerful for a variety of reasons. One, you're actually, if you have a meal without screens or devices at the table, you actually have to talk to each other, because what else are you going to do, right? And so now you're encouraging communication. You get to learn about what your child is doing. A lot of parents don't know what happened that day with their child, right? And if you don't have that opportunity to have those conversations, that's a big piece. Also, when you start to have healthy meals together, you're teaching your child about cooking, right? Cooking is a lost skill. Like, I've done a lot of work with an organization called Growing Chefs, and it's a charity that teaches children about food. And I remember they have chefs come in and teach children about, different nutrition. And I remember a child being confused once. They didn't know that a French fry came from a potato. So a lot of children don't have this basic nutritional knowledge about where food comes from. What does it mean to have a healthy plate of food, right? Not the sort of drive-through, eat in the car as we're going. But teaching children, also with children, when we can expand their palate of different foods, especially when they're younger, they're more likely to continue with that. We see a lot of kids that only want to eat a couple things, right? And so having and modeling, like we talked about earlier, this behavior of eating a variety of healthy foods, you're showing your child that that's what we do. And they learn from that, right? They're sponges. And so having that nutrition, big piece, cooking, right? Having that knowledge of food education, and then having that connection as a family. And I think that by doing that, you're also showing your child that this is a priority for your family.
That's right.
And when you show your children what's important because you make the time is something that is such a precious resource. And if you're showing your child that it's worth the time, that we spend the time together, then you're modeling that for them as well.
Great.
And not everyone's going to have the time. And so we're not pushing on people that every night should be family night, dinner night, because that's not practical. But as often as you can, right?
Yeah, I had I saw this tweet, and it was from a pediatrician, and she said, "I'm a pediatrician. I'm a best-selling parenting author, and tonight my child's eating strawberries dipped in ketchup for dinner." And I laughed at that, but I also think, and to your point, it's not about perfection, right? I think a lot of people think if I can't do it perfectly, then what's the point? But it's really about consistency and trying as best as you can to do it whenever possible, because when we give ourselves the grace to be a human, and no one's going to be perfect all of the time, but when the majority of the time we show what our priorities are because we vote with our time and our effort and our modeling, then we show that for children, because no one's perfect, but we can all...
The 90-10 rule.
Exactly.
It's 90% of what you do that determines your life.
100%.
Not the 10%. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
And if we just zero in on the food, we're around the table having dinner, well prepared, cooked, and we understand, the neurotransmitters are in the brain, they're in the gut, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. So what are the foods, if we look at just say tryptophan as a precursor for serotonin, what are the foods that are going to be providing that precursor to that happy neurotransmitter?
So, we look at things like we want to have a balanced plate, right? Lots of vegetables, especially, like green leafy vegetables, protein, all of that sort of thing, minimally processed, paying attention to oils, right? All of that, sugar. It's really big. And what's interesting, I think sometimes parents get really overwhelmed because it just feels like one more thing and we're all so busy. But I think when we think about it from the lens of creativity, we can start to find ways to incorporate different nutritional awareness and education, especially with children. The Growing Chefs, the organization I was talking to you about, with the founder, we were a part of in Ontario, this Ontario Food Network, so that's in Canada, where we were trying to advocate for having nutritional curriculum incorporated into schools. And this was really challenging because teachers are so busy. But our point was that if children are already learning math, then why not have the fractions that they're learning be a half a cup of this and a quarter cup of that? And I actually had the head of Growing Chefs email me recently, and we were doing this work 10 years ago, and it just got implemented in curriculum recently.
Wow.
That's great.
Congratulations.
So it's incredible, but this is where it's like, okay, how do we, with the children, find ways to do what we're already doing and incorporate it? And so the extension of what is on our plate, it's also involving the children in the process of cooking whenever possible, right? And teaching them. And, maybe they are young and they can't cut things, but maybe they can wash something, but getting them involved before they sit down at the dinner table is something that we're doing already, we're cooking, but when we incorporate them and teach them from the beginning, even grocery shopping, right? Going to the grocery store, and this is why we're getting this, and walking around the outside of the grocery store, right? And, buying healthy fruits and vegetables, but explaining to them why, right? Why it's important, not just saying eat this, but it's, and then the other thing is if you ask a child when they eat something healthy, how do you feel after? They have more energy, right? Helping them make that connection that when they put healthy food in their body, they feel better versus when they go to a birthday party and they eat tons of cake and sugar and they come home and they can't regulate their mood and then they crash, right? But helping them understand the connection between the food they put in their body and their feelings, it can help them to start to make those changes and the awareness of it and that connection, because they're so linked.
So one example that probably everybody knows, including children, is, eating turkey and falling sleepy.
Yeah, right? Thanksgiving dinner.
So Thanksgiving. And why is that? Because the turkey has high levels of tryptophan. Which create the serotonin, which help, that sort of regulate the mood. But the key that example is that that's true for every food we put in our body. That's just an example that people are familiar with. But if we address each food like that and put together that, balanced plate, proteins, vegetables, a few carbohydrates, and the right oils, especially the omega-3s, then we're actually creating that mood from the inside.
That's right.
And so that's what I wanted to get to, because, as often as possible, we want these real high-level, actionable, what can folks do at home? And so what I hear you both saying is that there are foods that can make you happy. For example, this might not be on the list of all, early age introduction. I mean, some of these are going to happen when the child's 3, 4, 5, 6 or older. And by the way, let's reiterate, this is another example of, role playing or at least modeling, because if you're not eating healthy, your child's probably not going to eat healthy either. But pineapple, so why? Because it contains B vitamins. Chocolate, why? Because it contains serotonergic precursors. Tomatoes, why? Because it's got lycopene, and all of these additional reasons. So this is a learning or teaching opportunity, a moment where maybe you're providing your child a snack and you can sort of insinuate, these strawberries here contain anthocyanidins, which may reduce stress and allow you to be happier. But, and here's the big but we can't always eat ourselves to therapeutic levels of, health conferring benefit. And what I mean by that is, somebody's sad or child's sad, feeding them strawberries is not going to make them instantly happy. Sure. Nor necessarily should they be, right? But where I wanted to go was child life in part manufactures ingredients that you could probably never put on a child's plate at high enough levels that could have their brains do certain things. Omega-3s is one example. You just said it. Yeah. Explain, EPA, DHA, and what you've done to make it easier, tasty, and everything else with the child life omega-3.
So just quickly, historically, omega-3s mostly found in high density in fish oils. So if we look back, cod liver oil was probably the original nutritional supplement in history. 100 years ago, parents were giving their children cod liver oil because somehow they grew up a little smarter and healthier. Now we know that omega-3s contain EPA and DHA. The DHA is the key fatty acid found in the brain. So over 50% of the brain is made from fats and oils, and 50% of those fats and oils is just DHA. So that's what the brain cell is made from, and the myelin sheath that are around the wire to help communication. So if we just understand that, we can give our children, the sources of omega-3s, but then supplementing it, you can get a much higher volume. And my opinion these days is that even when a parent does everything they can for their child to eat healthy, clean, organic all the time, still it's that 90-10 rule. It's not going to be 100%. So what we need to do to keep ahead of that curve these days is give our children those extra nutrients that make up for what they're not getting in their diet, but also help protect them from anything they shouldn't be getting in their diet, meaning the food additives, colorings, artificial flavors, all of those things. So we can do both. We can very easily do both if we give the right supplementation.
Absolutely. Does Dr. Mandich supplement with anything?
I do. I do. Yes.
What do you do if you want to hear that? Do you recommend that there potentially is science out there for certain ingredients that may actually boost the happiness index?
Well, the reality is that we try our best, right? But sometimes we can't get all of our nutrients from food, right? I take a fish oil. It's really important. And I take a B vitamin because I like my B vitamins. You know what? I feel like as an adult, one of the good tests is if you're not sure, try taking something for a while and stop taking it and see if you notice a difference.
Oh, I do that all
the
time.
Because, I've also done a lot of yoga trainings in my life. And one of my yoga teachers, Jill Miller, she used to say, we're students of our body and our body is our best teacher. And so I think that when we have the awareness of how we feel, and I think that also a lot of us don't realize how good we can feel.
Yes.
Right? We sort of are in this sort of like, I almost think about, I remember when I got glasses and I put glasses on for the first time and I was like, whoa, the world can look like this, right? And I think that nutrition is almost like when we can identify where the gaps are, supplement depending on what our sort of life circumstances are. It's like putting on glasses, because sometimes I wish I could just bottle up how good it is to feel good, because when we realize that that is what we're capable of, it changes things. But I think we get caught in the monotony of day to day, and we're just used to going around without glasses on. And so when we can do these things, it's also empowering. When we think about, there's so many things in this world that we cannot control, right? But there are certain things that we can control, and focusing on food and where there's gaps, filling those in with supplementation, with different, if we are noticing we need more green leafy vegetables, whatever it is. But when we can control those things, what we do know is that autonomy, so this idea of focusing on what we can control, is more of a predictor of our happiness than how good looking we are, how popular we are, how attractive we are, or how good our sex life is. So it's a big player. And one of the ways that we can take some autonomy, right, some agency, is to identify what are those things that we can do. And when it's, taking a multivitamin or fish oil or whatever it is for each person, when we do that, we're showing ourselves that we're taking some control of our health. And I think that that's a really empowering concept, to know that I'm actively participating in my health, and the downstream of that is my mental health, my thoughts, my mood, my behaviors, and my actions.
I love that you say autonomy. I love the way you just described it. I just wanted to bring this sort of juxtaposition of these two books up here. We've spoken about this off camera before briefly, but the idea here, I think, is in part what you're explaining. There is a pursuit of happiness, the idea that you're looking to be happy, and hopefully things will make you happy or a child happy. But then there's also something in the happiness of pursuit. And that is finding one's autonomy, and that is learning, to role play and be that that person that lives up to, I think, what the epitome of happiness is for your child, and that's, I think, the happiness in that is the happiness of pursuit itself, or the pursuit of optimal, living. And then a lot of that is what we're talking about. I have a quick little anecdote to share, right? So my father's side is riddled with depression and bipolar. Knock on wood, thankfully, I don't even know what it is to be depressed. I don't know what it's to be sad, thank God. I'm saying it's in my cards, but it didn't express. That's the genetic story. However, early days in school, when I was learning natural medicine, I learned about what tryptophan can do, the amino acid. And we learned about 5-hydroxytryptophan. And then I thought, with my dad's side, and maybe hopefully supplementally, if I take this, maybe it lowers my chances of developing any of that stuff. Hadn't experienced it at the time. I haven't to this day. Fast forward, studying my own genes, I came to learn that I've got this genetic susceptibility to low serotonin transport, right? So the inability to recycle, which most of us do pretty well. And that's the feel-good, happy mood hormone, serotonin. I realized, put two and two together, I'm like, I'm not sure if it would have ever happened, but having supplemented 5-hydroxytryptophan for the majority of my adult life, I haven't taken the chance to experiment with it. I continue to supplement with it. And it's just my own little story around, genetics, environment, my dad's history, supplementation, because I can never eat myself to those, turkey levels at Thanksgiving. That happens, but it's not every day. So that's my little anecdote. And I think maybe that's a nice little segue into out of nutrition, because, we could go on and on about the importance of nutrition, micronutrients and macronutrients. But there's this, people, parents, new parents, I certainly wish I had a Dr. Mandich and a Dr. Murray to talk to when I was a new parent. But building happiness through connection, emotional support, play. Can we speak a little bit about that? Because play is often, I've heard you say, the work of children, right? This is how play contributes to children's happiness and emotional well-being is incredibly important in building resilience long term. Can you speak to that?
Yes, and just to sort of tie in the pursuit thing, I did a talk at Lakehead University, which is a university in Northern Ontario in Canada, and I was talking about how happiness is not a destination, it's a practice, it's a habit, like we talked about. And the professor that had invited me to speak, it was on Zoom, it was during the pandemic, after the event, we were just sort of chatting on Zoom, and she said, when you were talking about that, it reminded me of this photo that I have on my fridge. and I want to send it to you. So she sent it to me, and it's from this wonderful children's book called Big Panda, Tiny Dragon, and it's based on a lot of sort of Buddhist philosophy. And the picture she sent me, it has this big panda with this tiny little dragon sitting on his back, and it says, which is more important, asked Big Panda, the journey or the destination? And then it says, the company, said the tiny dragon. And I think that that's it. It's not about where we're going. It's about who we're going with. And so to sort of look at that from the lens, that's the book, of play, is that this connection is really, that's the secret sauce of life, right? Like that's the part where we really get enjoyment. It's in doing those things, and play is something. And John Haidt, who's at Stern at NYU, he just had a book come out called The Anxious Generation. And one of the sort of big points in his book, which I think is brilliant, is this idea that children have lost, that's the book, it's really great. They've lost play, right? Because we aren't going outside.
Yep.
And when I do talk, sometimes I have slides, and I used to use this meme, and it was a bunch of bicycles out in front of a house, and it said, before cell phones, this is how we knew where our friends were. Remember? Yes. You go and you look around.
I love those accounts. I follow them all the time.
I put that up at a university, and it was just sort of like really quiet in the audience because they didn't get it anymore because we're really disconnected from play. I remember I've done a lot of focus groups with children and parents, and I remember I was doing a focus group with children, and I was asking them, we were actually talking about play, and one of them said, well, I don't like to play outside because there's no outlets there.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, that's where we're at.
It's deep.
Right?
That's where we're at.
And it's this thing where, especially as children, and we see this with sort of the helicopter type parents, right, where they want to just put their child in a bubble and protect them, but we're actually not protecting them. They need to go out and play and experience and learn how to interact with other people and have free time to do things as a child. And, if we look at sort of social media aside, what are the areas of opportunity where we can really influence children's behavior? It's encouraging play. It's giving them the space to not just hover over them at every single moment and control things, but let them experience, right? Like we all learn by making mistakes and figuring it out, by trying things out, by role playing with kids, with playing with dolls or Legos or whatever it is. And this is something I think when we focus on how do I make my child raise a healthy child, we think about nutrition, right? We think about physical activity, we think about sleep, but we often don't think about this idea of play and connection. And it's such an important part, and all of the research really supports this.
No, huge. And if we just take that piece and extend it to look at a whole lifetime, what we find, if we look at those blue zones around the world, the only one essential component that they all have, because they all have different foods, they have different lifestyles, things like that. But the one main factor that they all contain is that socialization and relationship that is maintained from childhood through their lifetime. So that part seems to be a part of human nature that is critical, necessary, and above all.
What about introverts, though? A lot of children are introverts. Play's the work of children. We said that. But if a child is perhaps even more enlightening for folks at home to hear is whether or not there's an index, an assay, a test, a quick review of my child's sort of aptitude for happiness. Does that exist? Because there's nothing wrong with being introverted and maybe sometimes not wanting to go out and play and spending a couple hours watching a video. But if that happens too often, how do I know if I'm at home listening and my child has a problem getting to be as happy as they possibly could be?
Yeah, when we look at personality characteristics, right, like introversion, extroversion, one of the big things with happiness across the board is fit. Because there's no one formula for happiness, right? We're each different. And if we think about what made us happy when we were 5 years old versus 15 years old versus 50 versus 100, it's changing. And so part of it is we have to know within ourselves and answer that question, what is it that makes me happy, right? And, often when I do sort of one-on-one interviews with people, I'll ask them, I'll say, are you as happy as you possibly could be? I'll ask this with children and with adults. And no one's ever said yes to me.
I was going to ask you, how often do you ever get yes back? Okay, that's good.
And then I'll ask, okay, well, what makes you happy? And often I see this pattern, right? When you start to see patterns, you're like, okay, so often what would happen is one of two things. So one, like before they start their exhale, they're answering my mom, my dog, my cat, my sister, my brother, whatever it is. So it's almost like reflexive. Or there'll be like this really long pause and they really have to think about it. And I'm like, okay, well, if we don't know what makes us happy, no wonder we're not as happy as we possibly can be. So we have to have that awareness for ourselves. And different people, it's different, right? And when we think about happiness, I sort of think of it as positive emotions, which can be expressed in different ways. So someone, if you are playing in the Super Bowl and you get a touchdown and you do your end zone dance, that is someone's experience of happiness. But someone else's experience of happiness can be leaving yoga class and, just being this blissed out Shavasana state or a state of contentment. It's differently expressed, but we identify it as a positive emotion that we experience. So it's asking ourselves, well, what does that look like? You may have a child that's very extroverted, that their happiness is dancing around and having dance parties all the time. And you may have another child that wants to go and read a book on the couch, right? So it's not about trying to force certain things, but it's about understanding what that looks like for your child, and we're all different. Okay. I will also want to mention one other study. I think this is fascinating. This is work from Dr. Sonia Lubomirsky, and she's one of the world's leading happiness researchers. And what they did in the study was they actually had people and they tried to make them more extroverted. They didn't use the languaging extroversion, but it was like talk to a stranger on a bus or talk to people. And what they found was for people that both identified as introverts and extroverts, doing that, trying to be more extroverted, even though they didn't use that language, but saw an increase in their happiness. It was only done for 1 week period, but is that it? Yeah. But it's interesting because I think that part of the reason is because extroversion, you're often talking to another person, which brings us back to that social connection piece. Because as humans, we're hardwired for connection. The longest running longitudinal study on happiness is still underway. It's done at Harvard. It's called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And the current lead investigator, his name is Dr. Robert Waldinger. And he just had a book come out, I think last year, called The Good Life. And the punchline of the book, and I'm not ruining it for anyone, it's a great book, is that the number one predictor of both our long-term health and our happiness is social connection.
Right.
Above how much money, race, age, education, all of that. And so I think that is what sort of ties back, is this idea of connection.
Okay. So Dr. Murray, you just talked about it. Dan Butner's Blue Zones and the Centenarian Project. And I think this is a great tie-in here. But then I have a question. And the tie-in is, okay, so there is social connectivity and culture and togetherness and so forth, and that establishes community and happiness. And then every child is happy for different reasons. That's genetic aptitude as well. But here's my question to you, Dr. Mandich, and that is, if on the same vein of the centenarians, those that live to 100 and well, eating different things and having different levels of exercise, etc., they also have this common denominator, Ikigai, which is sense of purpose. And if your sense of purpose is different as an adult than it is as a child, perhaps, how do we, and this is really now full circle to the question, how do we instill and remind our children of their sense of purpose in order to achieve happiness?
Yeah. So it's actually, I went down a really big Ikigai rabbit hole recently. I did a talk for retirees, and actually had done a segment previously on the show called The Social in Canada about Ikigai. And when you actually go into the research, the sort of westernized concept of Ikigai is not really what it is in Japan.
Oh, enlighten us.
And so the way it's marketed here is sort of this intersection between what you love to do, what you're passionate about, what you're paid for.
The Venn diagram.
Yeah, that Venn diagram. I love me a good Venn diagram, by the way. But when you actually look into the work in Japan, what it is, it's about finding things that you enjoy doing, but it's more focused on the micro and the small things. It's what is the connection to your community? What is it that makes you grateful? It's again, coming back to this concept of the micro, the small things day to day that build the habits. And so I think that, and we see this in retirement, right? In North America, we see that oftentimes rates of heart attacks increase significantly as soon as someone retires because they've lost their sense of purpose. And so whatever it is, at whatever age, it's what gives us meaning and purpose. It's like that drive that gives you the reason for doing what you're doing. Morning. Exactly. And we all need that as humans. We express it differently. Some people, they find it in raising a child. Some people find it in, military service or whatever it is. But it's about asking ourselves those questions of, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And why is this important to me? Because when we feel that we have meaning and purpose, because the other thing is a happy life doesn't mean like a smooth sailing life, right? Like a happy life doesn't mean that we're happy all of the time. Life is hard. Life is challenging. Hard things happen. Pandemics happen. Job losses happen. Divorces happen. Health issues happen. But when we start to build that muscle, like you had touched about earlier, it's like our highs get higher And our lows, it's not that they go away, but our lows get higher too, because we're more resilient and we're able to cope with the hard things that life is. And when we go through those hard things, we learn, right? And we develop skills. And you talk to a lot of people that have gone through really hard things, and it forced them to find more meaning, more purpose, to learn new skills, to figure out how to navigate that. But that enhances the richness of life, right? We think sometimes there's this term in research called psychological richness. And essentially what it means is like there's some people that find purpose and meaning through raising a child. Some people in terms of psychological richness want different experiences. They want to travel and see the world and try new food and learn new things and see new cultures. And so we're all different, and it really comes down to this concept of, okay, well, what is it for me? And it really is a personal thing. And I think that as a parent, when you start to ask those questions to yourself and start talking about with your children and getting to know your children, each child is different, right? A lot of parents are like, their kids can be very different. Yeah. I'm the oldest of 7 kids in my family. There's a range, but it really is having that conversation to think, what are the things that you like, that bring you joy, that fill you up?
Yeah.
So every child has their own purpose.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and similarly, and I'm embarrassed because I had to use ChatGPT to remind me of what I was thinking about. So it has responded with the right concept I was looking for, and this refers to post-traumatic growth. So this whole theory that children often, I mean, this is life. I mean, you experience traumas, emotional, mental, physical. But the thought and the concept is, some psychological thought, is that you have to often report having a stronger sense of purpose, having had trauma by comparison, by experience. So psychologists, and this goes way back to Viktor Frankl and
I was just
man's
about
search
to think
for meaning,
that's
right?
what just popped in my head.
So the idea is that you first have to have adversity. And children, growth experience and new experience, in order to actually have that contrast to know what happiness is. And that goes full circle right to the top when you said, no one's designed to be happy all the time. If anything, we're designed the other way, to be more adapt to stressors. And maybe even similarly, the hedonic adaptation, right, which is how people adjust to new circumstances. And also how we're all designed differently through genetic aptitude. Really is what it kind of boils down to.
Yeah.
How about, we come all the way back to the top with the mindfulness jar. I loved that. And I think parents at home want to hear more about simple tips and tricks that they can use with their growing children, 0 to 7. Gratitude, mindfulness, positive habits, instilling those positive habits. How do we do that? I'm just going to ask straight up. How do we do that?
I love this. I think so often we're in our head and we're either stressing about what may or may not happen in the future or something that happened already, and we're replaying it in our head. And so mindfulness is this beautiful practice where it brings us into the present moment. So our mind isn't wandering either direction. And because of that, when you're present, you're more able to enjoy or appreciate the things around you, right? So, for example, there's this concept in research called savoring, which is sort of, if you're having, a cup of coffee, you actually, instead of just drinking your coffee, you actually smell your coffee, you feel the warm mug, or you're eating ice cream with your children, or cookies, like you bake cookies or whatever it is, and you actually take time to appreciate what you're doing in the moment. And savoring is highly correlated with happiness and with positive emotion because it brings you into the moment, right? And with children, I think that it's really important to start to train their brain at a early age to notice things, because so often we're just like, you wake up and you go all day, and then you blink and the day is over, and then the week is over, and then the month is over, and then your child's going into the next grade at school, and it's like, where did the time go?
So true.
Right?
That's my reality. Where's time going these days? Yeah.
Or you get have you ever had the experience, you get in your car and you drive somewhere and you're like, how did I get here?
Autopilot.
Right? Just go on autopilot. And so I think that, and again, back to this concept of sort of autonomy, it's about focusing on the things that we can control. And so choosing to be present in the moment is so important, especially with children, because as every single parent knows, they grow so fast, right? And it's just like all of a sudden they're in university. And it's like, when did that happen? And so I think that ways that you can sort of help to teach children about mindfulness is to engage with them and to be present in an activity with them, right? And to ask them, how are you feeling right now? And why are you feeling that way? And having that sort of emotional intelligence and that emotional awareness of being able to identify those things. And it sort of goes hand in hand with this concept of, Carol Dweck's work around a growth mindset, right? Because when you start to praise a child for an outcome versus for the process, it's different. And so children with a growth mindset, it's not, what score did you get on your test, but it's how hard did you study? How much time did you spend focusing and learning on those things? And mindfulness is that sort of gateway to opening up that conversation because you're focusing on the process, not just the outcome. You're bringing them back into the moment, into what you're doing. And that's a really important piece, especially for children.
Great. And what percent, or again, we're going to ask you to define these undefinable things sometimes. But in terms of just movement, exercise, being outside, playing in that environment, how much every day, every week?
So I would say as much as possible. It's hard to quantify, but people want numbers. Yeah. So, at least, and sort of the nuance to that, a lot of my work when I first started doing research with children was looking at physical activity and sedentary behaviors in children. And we have come a long way in terms of wearables and technology, right, where we can put Fitbits and wearables on children now. But when I first started, we didn't have those. So we would do self-report questionnaires was the best way to assess physical activity. And you would say something like, okay, how much physical activity did your child have yesterday? And a parent would say, oh, they played soccer for an hour, so 1 hour. But the nuance to that is that really within that hour, how much of that time were they on the sidelines? How much was spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity? And so the piece too is that yes, physical activity, but moderate to vigorous physical activity is something that's really, when you look at sort of where you're going to get the most benefits, having at least, 30 to 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. If I had a child, then that's what I would be aiming for personally. Some days are different, but it's really also about sort of figuring out how to incorporate that into your family life. So maybe it's after dinner, we all go for a walk together, or, we play together. And it's so important. When I think about, if a parent was to ask me, what are the 3 sort of big factors where we can really make some change? It's nutrition, it's physical activity, and it's sleep. Foundational. And the wonderful thing too about physical activity is that the benefits, again, we talked about how our body is like this little chemistry factory, right? When you start to move your body releases endorphins, right? And you feel good. And so it's all connected, but it's about finding what activities children enjoy. But across the board, what we know is that, in research, we see this, that sometimes physical activity can be as effective as an antidepressant in terms of mitigating depression.
Love that research.
Right?
No, absolutely. I mean, the number one treatment for depression is exercise.
And it's interesting, when we think about, physicians will often reach for a prescription pad. You come in, you're not feeling that great. It's like, okay, here's an antidepressant. And there is a time and a place, right? If your body isn't producing the precursor to serotonin, no amount of gratitude is going to get you there. But before you reach for that, my question is, how much movement do you have in your day? What is your sleep like? What are you eating? What are you listening to and surrounding yourself with? How much time are you spending on social media? Because that's sort of the low-hanging fruit where... But again, it's this tricky thing because we live in this modern convenient world where we just want to take a pill. Right. And I think as parents, parents have this huge opportunity to sort of rewrite that narrative, right?
And I think everything you're talking about separately and together here, it brings me back and my, bent on thinking about genetics, maybe more than I probably should, because it plays a role, but it's not everything, is this one gene called BDNF. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Every mother, father wants the healthiest, smartest, brightest child with the best neuroplastic, which just means, neurons are constantly firing together, wiring together, and uncoupling, which, by the way, as I'm sure you'd agree, uncoupling or forgetting things is as important as remembering them in context. But exercise, sunlight, sleep, vitamin D, omega-3s, DHA in particular, all is going to work together, and exercise being one of the most important. Heating your brain, by the way, is going to work together to upregulate BDNF, which is neuroplasticity, which is how to grow the good or the happiness in your brain, as Rick Hansen explains.
I'm a big fan of Dr. Hansen.
Yeah, in this article here. And I think that's just empowering because there are real things, all of which you talk about on a regular basis and you practice in your clinical practice, that will increase the happiness index, which, by the way, I think we're both remiss. Is there even a thing? Is there a happiness index?
Well, so every year March 20th is the International Day of Happiness. So every year, the World Health Organization releases a ranking of all the countries in the world in terms of their happiness. So, but again, it's a point of debate in the happiness world because of how they assess it. And also, there's a big cultural piece to happiness too, because here in the Western world, our idea of happiness is very different than, say, if we jump over the pond to Asia, for example. Here we see it's a more individualistic me, ego, I. Over there, it's more of a collectivist community, us, we. So it's hard to compare countries across the world because of that. It's even hard to measure happiness, right? But what's interesting about measuring happiness is what we do know from research is that as humans, we are pretty good at self-reporting our own happiness. So we're pretty good at figuring out if we're happy or not. So if a participant was in my research, and often we'll use like questionnaires, and then we'll sort of score it and get a number. And if I was to ask someone on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are they? Chances are that what I would get using one of those questionnaires would be pretty close, if not the same as that. But what we're not as good at as humans is figuring out what it is that makes us happy. We often think it's the big moments, but it's really, like we talked about earlier, those small things day to day, the frequency over intensity, that is what actually adds up to a happy life. We think it's the day that we get the new car, the new house, or whatever, but because of hedonic adaptation, which you mentioned earlier, we adapt to things as humans. And so it's about looking for those areas of opportunity, those micro moments that adds up to more happiness, which I think as a parent is a very exciting and empowering concept, because it's not about the big trip to Disney World. It's about the, after dinner, we're all going to play together sort of thing, that's really where the happiness is.
Isn't that our Achilles heel in North America? I mean, let's call it the West. I'm going to make a very short, maybe unsupported, unsubstantiated argument here, but the West, we revere happiness potentially as the lack of depression, where this mindset, maybe overly medically, pharmaceutically oriented. I don't need an antidepressant, therefore maybe I'm happy. I don't know if you guys would agree with that, but culturally, and then you mentioned this, a couple of minutes ago, like the way that's defined across the pond is different. Values are different. And the stuff here, like happiness is equated with stuff and with things and status. If I've got that, I'm happy. If I don't need an antidepressant, I may be okay. Or it's the antithesis of not being depressed is, I guess, what I'm trying to establish, a very poorly established argument for it. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Are you good with answering some questions from our wonderful followers on social media?
Absolutely. I love questions. Okay. I'm a researcher. We love questions.
Of course. So this is somebody from Instagram who's asking, my child often gets upset when things don't go their way. What are some of the techniques I can use to help them bounce back and stay happy?
Well, I mean, I get upset when things don't go my way too.
It's not unusual. It's not unusual.
It's a human thing. I think that, and it's really not about things going your way or not, because now it's back to that control thing, right? And there's a lot of things in life that we can't control. It's about our response to that and what that is. And when we think about healthy psychological development, if you wanted something, like your child wanted to make a sports team, for example, and they didn't make the team, and they're sad about it and they're upset, that makes sense because they're disappointed. And I think that number one is allowing your child to feel those emotions, but helping them to identify why that is and what, if they had things that they can control, like maybe they wanted to make the basketball team, but they weren't out in the driveway after school practicing, right? Then it becomes, okay, well, did you try your best? Was this your full effort? I think that it's not about having children want to control things. It's about having them learn how to emotionally regulate their responses when that happens. That growth mindset piece comes in a lot here too, right? Where, okay, well, what could you have done differently? And also, why are you feeling what you're feeling, right? Because I think that if a child you have to make the connection between behavior and outcome, right? And teaching children some responsibility for that. It's hard as a parent because when you see your child upset, you just want them to feel better. But you're not actually doing them a service if you just kind of coddle them and don't allow them to go through the emotions that they're experiencing, right? It's about having those conversations and allowing them to be in those emotions, but then also not marinating in them for like weeks, right? Because that's the other piece, is that when you experience some of the more challenging emotions. And I don't use the word positive and negative emotions. I don't like that because I don't think emotions are inherently negative or positive, right? If you're feeling anxious because your child said they were going to do their homework and they went to school and they didn't do their homework, anxiety probably makes sense because you weren't responsible for what you were doing. And so emotions are data, they're information. And so helping your child to tap into and to learn about that information, it helps them establish healthy habits and healthy psychological functioning.
Words of wisdom. And if I heard you earlier, you said also maybe remind yourself to ask your child what makes them happy, and to better have them understand what makes them happy is to maybe get back to some of the literature, which is around sense of purpose and, having them understand at an early age to be aware of what those things are.
To understand and recognize, I think, right?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. And I think sometimes we have a vision for our child in our mind, and they may have something different. And so that incongruency can be really hard if, I have a friend who grew up a gymnast and wanted her daughter to be a gymnast. She had no interest in that. And so, when we try to force that on the child and then they're not happy, when we start to invite those conversations about what do you enjoy, it helps them to develop the self-awareness for them because they are their own being. And as parents, it's not about molding them into what we want them to be, to shape them into that. It's allowing them to have self-awareness, to allow them to grow into the person that they are.
Sarah from YouTube asks, how do I encourage my child to express gratitude and appreciate the little things in life without it feeling forced? It's a perfect segue from that.
I love that. And I love that Sarah's asking that question because that's, like we talked about, awareness is step one, right, for behavior change. And so I think one is asking children, we talked about some gratitude practices, whether it be around the dinner table, whether it be the gratitude jar, a gratitude journal, families sort of just having those conversations, but also helping them understand why that's so important, right? They may not understand the concept like we talked about of the negativity bias, but it's like when you talk about things that you're grateful for and then you say, well, how do you feel now? And when they're like, oh, I feel good, it helps them to make that connection as to when they focus on things that they're grateful for, then it can help them. Another really cool one that I see is making like a gratitude poster in their bedroom or something, right? Where they put pictures of their grandparents or their friends from school or pet or animal. So there's a visual of it. And again, it really comes back to modeling that behavior like we sort of started at the beginning of this conversation. It's you telling your child what you're grateful for and then asking them and helping them to make that connection for themselves. And then, like we also talked about, it's about establishing the habit. This isn't a one-time thing, right? We practice gratitude for our life. We don't just do it one time and then tick the box.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I think when it becomes this tick box, like, did I do gratitude today? Yes. We're losing a lot of the impact, right? When it becomes more of a habit and something that we enjoy doing and it's not just going through the motions to do it, that's when we really see the power of it.
Absolutely. And I'd argue that in today's day and age, certainly in North America, that in order to be able to express gratitude probably relies to some degree on having the available neurotransmitters for happiness around in the first place. So could you explain to our listeners here, I know you do this in your clinical practice all the time, is educate parents on the importance of B vitamins. I know, Dr. Mandich, you mentioned you take B vitamins. Why are they so important? And they're no longer in the food supply chain, organic or not.
Yeah. So we have two nervous systems, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and both of them rely on B vitamins, the whole complex, especially B6, B12, to actually function and regulate themselves. So without those, you have the software in there, but it cannot work because it doesn't have the nutrients that it needs to drive the system. It's very simple. I mean, it's a machine. If you don't have the right ingredients, if you don't have the right fuel, it doesn't work right. So.
And how early should parents be considering giving their child if not a supplemental B family of vitamins, and or even a multi-mineral?
Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, it depends on whether the mother's breastfeeding.
Right.
If she's breastfeeding, then she should take all the B vitamins and the multi and the omega-3s and the vitamin C.
Right, makes sense.
Then the baby. But, at any stage and any pre-stage of that, when a child starts eating solid foods, so 6-7 months old, that's when you can think about supplementing, and starting with a good multivitamin mineral for children, number one. Number two, omega-3 DHA for the brain to keep growing. vitamin D, just because everybody's deficient on it so much these days. We don't know around the world exactly why, but parents, adults, and children. And then, number 4, we call it the core 4. So multivitamin, DHA, vitamin D, and then vitamin C as that primary antioxidant to protect your child from whatever's in the environment that they're exposed to that they don't need in their body. So simple 4 things can go a long way if you start early in the right way. Yeah.
Amazing. And we have a question from Twitter. What are some fun and easy ways that I can introduce mindfulness to my child's daily routine?
Ooh, I love that parents are asking these questions, right? Because we're not just saying like mindfulness is important. It's how do I do it, right? And I think that's key. Yeah. It's that action piece of it. It's kind of like, that saying, I see it all the time, like knowledge is power, knowledge is power. And I'm always like, no, knowledge is potential power, right? It's what we do with what we know. And so we've discussed mindfulness is important. There's research to support it, but how does that actually translate into the daily life as a parent? And so some of the things I think that are really important begin right when they wake up. So when they're brushing their teeth, that's a great time to start to introduce mindfulness, right? It's okay, we're paying attention. What does your toothpaste taste like? Set the timer so that they're aware that and they're fully present in it.
There's a savory sensory thing you were mentioning.
Exactly. And this is something where your child's supposed to brush their teeth anyway, right?
Right.
And so they're already doing it. And so it's when you can kind of like habit stack, right? So they're already doing that. So how can we add an element of, okay, let's focus on this. Let's watch ourselves brushing our teeth. Let's make sure we get in between every single tooth, right? It's that skill where you're teaching them to be fully present in the moment with something they're already doing. And then also, like, I think devices are like screens, iPads, phones is not mindful at all. And often, like, I have a niece that loves to watch like unboxing videos, like, and then the YouTube will just keep auto playing them, right? And so that's the opposite of that. You didn't just put on to watch one specific video, you let the autoplay go. So that's a good example to show them where we're not being mindful anymore. We're not intentional about what we're doing. And I mean, this continues, like I, even as an adult, as someone who works in this space, I live in a condo. And sometimes I'll be waiting for the elevator and I'll take my phone out of my pocket and just start scrolling without even realizing that I'm doing it. And so I think with children, we can start where it's like, if you want to have some screen time, are you being mindful about it? Is there a certain amount of time and what are you watching and why? It's really asking kids, what are you doing and why are you doing it, and helping them make that connection as opposed to just sort of putting on the TV and, like just vegging out.
Or
right?
telling them no and grabbing it away from them and saying you've had enough, as if they were the ones to make the choice in the first place. Wonderful, wonderful advice. And the last question is, my child has trouble connecting with others. And I think I'm going to speak to perhaps, this is a question from Facebook, to the whole introversion, the personality score factor. I don't know for sure, but the question is really, how can I help them build stronger relationships and find happiness through connection? Problem, I guess, building friends. She's saying trouble connecting with others. Unclear, but we actually spoke about this as a great place to sort of end our discussion, because how is it? I mean, it's easy to have the conversation with another adult and explain the Centenarian Project and Blue Zones and so forth, but how do we instill in our children to make connections in order to develop that happiness factor from that?
So, I mean, we've talked a lot about how important connection is, but connection can look differently, right? And so especially if you have a more introverted child, they may experience connection from reading a book. And so I think sometimes we think connection is just spending time one-on-one with someone, and that is a part of it, but it's a broader conversation than that. And so if they're feeling connected to the sort of protagonist in a book or something like that, and also social media and technology gets a bad rap, but also sometimes it can be a way to connect, right? So when we're intentional about it, at the university that I was at, I taught there, and one of the courses I taught was a course called Health and Social Media. And my first lecture, I put up, my first slide was a picture with the wisdom from Spider-Man. And it said, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that sometimes we have an opportunity with devices. If your child has, some like video games, right? Like they actually connect, they have their headsets and they connect with each other. So it's not inherently a bad thing. It's when it becomes a all night long that we do it thing that it becomes a problem. And so I think that sort of broadening the perspective of ways that we can connect. But then especially when they're younger too, creating those opportunities, arranging play dates for your child, finding out, and especially if they're more introverted, like the question was, then maybe it's not taking them somewhere where there's a whole bunch of kids playing, but maybe it's having one friend come over, or things like that. Or maybe they, want to just connect with an animal. And that's another big piece of it too, is, maybe having a dog where they take the dog, depending on their age, for a walk. But establishing connections beyond just sort of the one-on-one time, I think, is really powerful.
Okay, fine. That was a way to bring in Joko. Please tell us about Joko, your pride and joy.
He's
a special
Talk
animal.
about connection. And I live alone. So I don't have a lot of day-to-day connection like a family. And so I have a 3-year-old French bulldog, Jocko, and Jocko.
Sorry, Jocko.
He brings me connection, but for a variety of reasons. One, I talk to my dog all the time in my house. I narrate my morning. But also when I take my dog for a walk, and I think this is something that's really important too, there's research on what's called, there he is. Look at him. What a guy.
So
He's been on TV with me.
There's like a million pictures of him here on Instagram.
Yeah, he has his own Instagram, Life of Jocko.
God.
So when I take Jocko for a walk, he's so cute. As you can see, he's also a model. He models for a brand in Canada we have called Canada Pooch. That's him modeling
So
there.
nice.
People stop me and they want to pet the dog, take a photo with the dog, ask questions about the dog. And I think sometimes when we think about connection, we think about the time that we spend with our family or our friends. But there's research on what's called weak ties. So those conversations that you have at the airport or on the bus, or with the barista. And those actually play a big role in our happiness as well. So sometimes when we think connection, it's that broader thing of, and there's research that shows that when people are encouraged in a study to have to talk to a weak tie, to make that conversation, whether they are introverted or extroverted, both groups see an increase in their happiness. And a lot of introverts think that that wouldn't be the experience, but the data says otherwise. And so looking for those areas that we can have those sort of weak tie connections too is a big piece of it.
Right. So not just your best friend or close family members, but the bus driver,
Right.
or the barista. That's a dopamine hit, which is not in and of itself, but one of the happiness hormones. Yeah. I don't know. I learned a lot. How about you? I feel like you're going to have to come back for a whole part 2 here because, an hour and 20 minutes later, we're only partway into it.
Yeah.
No, it's a great pleasure, first of all,
Yes,
to have you here.
Thank you.
Gillian. And, in preparation for this last night, I did a little research on my own. So I looked up the Greek philosophers. What was their most important element of happiness? And it came up Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, purpose. So I congratulate you. You're obviously somebody who found their purpose. Your breadth of knowledge and wisdom is fantastic. And it's a pleasure to be here and for you to share it with people. Thank you.
I think a lot of people revere her as one of the heroes of COVID. We're on the heels of that, and it's a not so distant memory, but you came in at the right time. Forget Spider-Man. You have your own cape, and a lot of people benefited. But obviously, every child is unique, but understanding the science behind happiness, and you're able to, really summarize that for us with very helpful tips. I also thank you for your insights, encouraging parents to explore, all kinds of different ways on resources fostering happiness and emotional well-being at home. Where can everyone find more of you online? Obviously, GillianMandich.com.
GillianMandich.com. That's a good spot.
Social media handle and
is at Dr. like Dr. Gillian. I'm Gillian with a G.
Dr. Gillian, and that's it? That's the handle? Dr. Gillian?
Dr. Gillian Mandich, I think it is.
Dr. Gillian Mandich, yeah. That's what I thought.
Mandich, yeah. I should know that. But I just want to thank both of you because I think all three of us at this table are united in that we care about children and children are our future. And so creating the best, we talked about autonomy, right? What we can control, and to be able to bring information, products, this conversation to the forefront is just such a beautiful thing. And the passion from both of you, just again, purpose and meaning, right? I can feel it from both of you. But to invite someone like me to have this conversation is just so forward thinking and so essential. And you're modeling that behavior for all of us. So it's been, in terms of gratitude, I'm so grateful to be here with you and to have have this conversation and to be able to, expand people's concepts of what it means to be healthy, happy, and thriving.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us on The First 7 Years. Don't forget to subscribe and share the episode with any parents or caregivers in your life if you're not one yourself. Together, we can help raise a happier, healthier generation. Until next time, stay well and stay connected.